I mean, and the other paper that of yours that I really like in that respect, that sort of really sort of threw up, I think a really important issue is the paper where you looked at people and their identification of breeds of dogs, and then you did the DNA analysis of them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a big issue with what are supposedly dangerous breeds and their identification on phenotype. And your work just sort of basically said, the dogs that don't look anything like a pit bull could well be a pit bull, and those that look quite a lot like a pit bull could have no pit bull in them whatsoever. I thought that was a fascinating piece of work, and it's quite a recent one, and several people have replicated those sorts of effects as well. I mean, again, Clive Wynne and Lisa Gunter, they've been following up, I think, on some of that work as well. I just thought it was absolutely fascinating. How did you come about this?
Well, to go way back, when I was in high school, we in the summer times, we were encouraged, I don't know if it was through scouts or what, to become what it calls candy stripers, which means you could go and help in medical facilities, and you wore an apron that had red and white stripes. And you were just a teenager, so it wasn't anything real specific what you did, but you got exposed to the medical field. And so when I was applying to be a candy striper, either I wanted to do this or my mother suggested it, because she was always wanted me to be a veterinarian. I said, well, why don't I work at the veterinary hospital as a candy striper at the base? Because this was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So there was the medical facility there, and there was the veterinary clinic that the Air Force had for dependents, pets, and for other animals at the facility. And so there were open office hours for vaccinations and physical exams of dependents' pets. So I was very important. I was there behind the desk asking them to sign in and what breed your dog is and all this. And I will never forget actually getting up, sort of leaning over, looking at the dog that was on the floor over the desk and saying to the woman, and what kind of mixed breed is this? And she just went, this is a Welsh Corgi.
It reminds me when I was seeing practice, in mixed practice, one of the vets who did the large animal work did the evening surgery, and this lady came in and he said, oh, looks like your lurcher's got a bad back. And she said, that is not a lurcher, that is a borzoi, and he's supposed to move like that.
Yes. Yeah, so then I started really paying attention to breeds. But I also had German Shepherds and Huskies at different points in my life. And I would go through shelters, I would see any dog that had brown hair and relatively short brown hair was usually called a German Shepherd or a Shepherd mix. And anything with a curled tail was a Siberian Husky. And they didn't look anything like a German Shepherd or Husky. So first I started just taking pictures systematically at shelters and their cage cards to see. And my goal was to then do a study where I'd ask people what the breeds were to see about inter-observer reliability. Well, one thing led to another, and I moved from that location. I was getting all those photographs to a place where I was now getting video cameras available and doing that. And then all of a sudden DNA became available. So scratched everything and started again and got volunteers, solicited clients from the area of Western University here. But most of the dogs came from, like, I think 17 different locations. There were 20 dogs and all over the country. So they weren't just in this location. And then randomly put them in, well, categorized them by weight, and then randomly picked X number of animals from each weight group, and then did video clips of them. And then traveled to 30 different locations and had people fill out a questionnaire when they saw a 1-minute video clip of the dogs, both sides, front, back, and moving. And there was not much agreement as to what the dogs were. The only one that really stood out was the dog that looked like a Dalmatian because it had some spots, and most people did guess it had Dalmatian, although 10% thought it was a purebred, which it clearly wasn't. But there was very little relationship between what the person said was the dog and what the DNA showed. Even if you looked at what the person said was either their first or second guess, and then looked at how many different breeds were found in the DNA, sometimes there still was no correlation. And it was very interesting.
And the sad thing is, you know, once somebody gets into their head that a dog is of a particular breed, they immediately make all sorts of assumptions about,
Absolutely.
you know, its behavior and all sorts. I have an exercise that I do with the students actually where I take some of the description of the sort of breed typical behavior from the breed standard of different breeds, and I just say, I read them out to the students and say, right, tell me what breed of dog this is, and you know, I give them whatever it is, and you know, somebody might say that's a Dalmatian, somebody might say that's a Jack Russell, somebody say it's a Labrador, and you find it's the Border Collie or something like that. And I said, you know, this is it. This is one of the things you've got to be so careful of in this field, is what we call confirmation bias. That once you get something into your head, and you know, breed standards on behavior are a little bit like horoscopes. If you believe in them, you'll see the bits that you want to pick out. So yeah, that's typical of that breed. But if you're given it blind and you have to allocate it to a breed, you just can't do it because it could relate to anything.
Well, one of the interesting things about this study when I was doing it was after they filled out the questionnaires and turned them in, I would show them the DNA results of the dogs they had just identified. And they absolutely didn't believe it.
Oh, who needs science when you've got a strong opinion, eh?
Yes. But then I showed them the pictures Scott and Fuller had in their book that they published on genetics and behavior of the dog, where they showed F1 and F2 generations of mixed breeds, of purebreds crossed. So you would get dogs that were 50% Border Collie and 50% Basenji, but yet they looked like Beagles, Labradors. And when they saw those F1 crosses and F2 crosses, they started beginning to nod their heads saying, well, maybe there's something to this. But they would not believe the DNA analysis. They had to see the pictures of the crosses.
It's interesting. I had a few years ago, I had a PhD student, and she was actually a social worker, and she came to us. I'm not sure how she originally found us, but she came to us and sort of said she was interested in doing, I think she actually wanted to do a talk course, and we just said, why don't you do a research degree? And she ended up doing a PhD with us exactly on this. And because she was a social worker, you know, she encountered a lot of issues relating to discrimination, disadvantaged groups, etc. And you know, we've published a few papers from there. One of the experiments we did is we took a picture of a crossbred from a shelter, and then told people it was called something like a Zikiti or something like that, and said, this is a terrier breed from Puerto Rico. What can you tell us about it? And people would just tell us all sorts of things, you know, once they've seen that picture. And then you give them the same picture and you tell them that it's you know, a pastoral breed of dog. And again, they tell you all about its behavior. This, you know, this mongrel, this mutt that's in the shelter. But people just make these sweeping assumptions. And Tracy Clark, who did the work, I mean, she had some really nice stuff. And she introduced me to a thing called the contact hypothesis in humans, which is that people are much more willing to believe stereotypes if they don't have contact with the groups that they're stereotyping. So the more contact you have with, you know, groups, the more you realize that actually, you know, there's good, bad, big and small, or whatever in every population. And so we started to do this actually with Staffordshire Bull Terriers in the rescues here. And we asked groups of people, and the interesting thing that came out of it was people who had very little contact with dogs absolutely believe the stereotypes on the dogs, you know, and on the pit bulls and whatever. But the people who worked in shelters, who had a lot of contact with these dogs, but the dogs that had ended up in shelters also tended to believe the stereotype of the breed. Whereas the vets who'd seen Staffordshire Bull Terriers across the spectrum, and the nurses, really didn't sign up to it. So it wasn't just about amount of exposure. And again, it goes very much with the human work. It's about the context in which you have the exposure as well. You might see loads of these breeds of dog, but if you only see them in one context, then, you know, you will develop that stereotype. Now, actually, a story, actually, I nearly failed my finals in public health, because, well, in public health, we, you know, not to me the most inspiring of subjects, important subject, but the external was this person, and I was never very good at exams, and particularly vivas, because the things I find interesting are often things I know very little about, which is why I'm interested in them. And I remember in my first year, the dean took me to one side and said, "You've got to do something about your viva technique, because you're just not going to make it if you don't. You've got to stop talking about the things." And he said, "You know, try to steer the viva towards topics you know something about." And in public health, it was
steer the viva. What?
Viva oral exam. We have oral exams for the finals for the vet school. You have the written exams, and then you have the oral exams. So we have vivas. That's the Viva Voce it stands for. And it was around about this time, there was, you know, this is just before the dangerous dogs legislation came in, and he asked something about sort of, well, what breed of dog would I recommend for a childminder? And I was thinking, great, something I know something about. We could talk about behavior. And I said, a well-socialized Rottweiler, deliberately trying to be a bit slightly provocative. And, you know, the Rottweilers had been reported as attacking a number of kids at this point. And he said, to my amazement, he said nothing. And the rest of the viva went on. They asked me about notifiable diseases in fish and God knows what. And then just as I was leaving, it was finished, and I was walking out the door, and he turned to me and he said, "I think that was very irresponsible what you said about childminders." And I looked at the internal examiner, and I said, "Excuse me, but this is an oral exam. If you don't agree with something that I say, I think I should have the right to defend myself." So I was thinking, well, you have your allocated 20 minutes. And my hand was literally on the door, and one of my friends, Karen Davis, was Karen Nicholas, was waiting to come in, and I just sort of, and the internal said, "Yeah, you should have the right." So I said, "Look, let me explain." And I said, "There's a difference." He said, "I used to work in the RAF, and I never met a good Rottweiler that I trust with kids." And I said, "There's a difference between a trained dog and a socialized dog." And we basically had this stand-up row for about 10 minutes. So poor Karen got, well, lucky Karen, she only got about a 10-minute viva as a result. But, you know, to the university's credit, I passed. But it was just that issue that, you know, people had got this idea in their head, and yeah, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. But yeah, is it this sort of people's willingness to stereotype? And yeah, on average, a breed might be here and another breed might be here in a trait, but the variability in it is so enormous. And this is the thing which I think, you know, that we really need to get across. And, you know, and again, yeah, dealing with problem behavior, people say, well, I've always had this breed of dog and I've always treated them the same. Why is this one different? I said, because each dog is an individual.